Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. If you've watched one of my videos, if this is the first video what you're watching, you are now part of the family. So if you want to join permanently, subscribe down below and turn on notifications to be notified anytime I post a video. Today's video specifically is a 2024 reading wrap up. I got back into reading this year, like fully reading with ratings and reviews. I want to say midway through the year, like June or July time, because up until that point, I just didn't have time to fully appreciate reading as an actual hobby, as something I enjoyed, because there was so much chaos going on with my college course at the time. So I got back into it this year, and in the last 6 months, I've read a disappointing amount of 27 books. But by the time the year actually ends, it'll be probably a bit more than that, because there's still 2-3 weeks until the year ends. But I did, because it was getting back into it, I did end up falling into a couple of book slumps here and there. And so it ended up being less books than I wanted it to be. But I'm going to do a little reading wrap up. I got the questions from Destiny Sidwell's video as well as Larry Reed's video, two of my favorite booktubers possibly ever. So I'm just going to go through the different prompts or questions and talk a little bit about each one of them. So, most disappointing book of the year. For me, this might be slightly controversial because I know it's a very loved book and popular book out there. But for me, it was actually It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. It ended up being a 1.5, 2-star book for me. I did not enjoy the pacing of the book, the writing of the book, and then not to mention all of the controversy about Colleen Hoover as a person and everything that happened with the film adaptation of the book. But the book itself, I felt very disappointed in. I think it was a very hyped book in its era, and I ended up reading it for a reading challenge thing that I did earlier this year on my channel. And it didn't hit for me, and I think that's perfectly fine. If you enjoyed the book, that's completely fine. Same as all of these books that I'm going to talk about. There's ones I absolutely loved that aren't loved by a lot of people. There's ones that are loved by lots of people that I didn't enjoy. You are free to have your opinion. I'm free to have mine. Just don't hate, because everyone has different tastes, and I don't see the point in any of that. Just don't get offended by any of my opinions, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. What was an underdog book for me this year? It was actually The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I've never read any of his books before, and I read this one randomly because it was chosen for me for a TBR video thing that I did, and it was a 5-star for me. That book, the whole concept was so unique. I'd never read anything like it before, and it was just such a good book that put so many things into perspective for me and made me also ponder about life a bit. And the reason I'm putting it as my underdog book is because I read no reviews or anything before reading the book, same as most books I read. And I had low expectations because I didn't know what to expect from this. And I loved it. It ended up being one of my top books of the year that I read. An overhyped book I read, same as the first answer, It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. Like I said, there was lots of hype around it, and I know lots of people enjoyed the book, but I didn't. And after reading it, I did not understand the hype, and I felt like it was overhyped from that perspective of just I didn't enjoy it, and that's fine and fair and is what it is. A book that surprised me. This was one of the first full-on fantasy romantasy books I read this year, because I was reading a lot of fantasy and then a lot of romance and mystery, and it was like everything was in its category. But it was the first crossover between romance and fantasy, creating romantasy, that I read. And it surprised me because I'd never read anything like it before, which was The Serpent and Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. It's the first book in the Crowns of Nyaxia series. I'd need to look at the pronunciation for that word, because anytime I say it, I have no idea how to say it, but it's one of my favorite book series I read this year. And it surprised me because I had no idea what it was about. And it just hit. It hit. It was a very high rated book for me, and it got me obsessed with that series. My favorite book couples of the year, or couple, but for me it's couples. There's 3. One is a book I read extremely recently, like we're talking a few days ago by the time I filmed this video, which is Rowan and Alex from Santa Please Bring Me a Boyfriend by Sophie Reynolds, which if you haven't read this book, please read it. It is such a cute, sweet romance. Rowan is a single mother and Alex is a delivery driver. It's a meet cute. They fall in love, but they're super relatable characters, and it feels very much like something that could happen to me. Similar in a way of like Liz Tomfordy books. It's escaping reality, but not too far. It's like you could actually see it happening in real life. And it was just such a sweet, cute book to read. The next couple is Araya and Rain, but from The Serpent of Wings of Night, as well as The Ashes and the Starcast King. Books 1 and 2 in the Crowns of Nixia series by Carissa Broadbent. Their dynamic, the way it changed, it went back and forth, the banter. I loved this. And the last one is Alex and Henry from Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McKinston. I can't believe it took me so long to read this book, and neither can my sister because she bought it for me like 2 years ago. But it took me so long to actually get to this book, and I enjoyed every single second of it. It was one of the first LGBT books I'd read, and I was obsessed. The dynamic, the way that the emails they sent, the phone calls, everything was so sweet to read, and I just love them so much. The next is your favorite main characters of the year. Number 1 is Araya from The Serpent and the Wings of Night and The Ashes and the Starcast King by Carissa Broadbent. I love her. I think she is such a good female main character in a book series. The way that the book was written, and you look back on her past as well as living in her present, getting to know her on such a deep level. I love this book series, and I can't recommend Crowns of Nixia enough. I just can't. The next one is Eden from The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith. Heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching, super sad book. Look up trigger warnings before you read it. But Eden, such a complex character, but the way Amber Smith wrote her, she was so real, and it was one of the realest representations of mental health I'd seen in a book ever. And it really, really just stuck with me. It's one that's been playing on my mind for ever since I read it. The last favorite main character of the year is Evelyn Hugo from The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I went into this book not knowing what to expect, and I was pleasantly surprised by every single twist and turn it took. I think Evelyn Hugo, from the outside world perspective, is very easy to hate, but getting to know her personality and her behind the scenes life and personality and just the complexities of her as a character was so enjoyable to read. Not to mention all the little things that were in there, like the headlines and news articles and stuff that were placed in the book that would just made it so much more fun to read as well. New favorite author you discovered this year. I have two, which might be cheating, but one is Carissa Broadbent. Like I said, Crowns of Nixia series, obsessed with it, and I want to read more of her books away from that series. And the second one is Liz Tomfordy, Windy City series. Love that series so much. They're very different. Carissa Broadbent is, you are definitely escaping very, very far into a completely different world and universe. And Liz Tomfordy is like, you're escaping, but in arm's reach. You're reading, but it's realistic to a certain degree. And so that's why I chose two, because they're two different types of reading. And they were both possibly the books this year that I rated the highest were from these two authors. So I love them so much. Author that didn't work for you this year, very expected, Colleen Hoover. And then Kyla Stone. I read Edge of Collapse by Kyla Stone, which is the first in the entire series, and it was so slow. It was meant to be a thriller. That was its genre, a thriller. And nothing happened until like the end of the book. But by the time the end of the book got around and all the action and stuff was happening, I was over it. Like, I couldn't even get into like, oh my God, and this happened. Like, I just couldn't get into it because I was like, I'm bored. And I think that's the worst thing that can happen with any type of entertainment you're partaking in, whether it's reading or a film, a series. If it gets to a point where you're like, I'm bored watching this, reading this, it's like, it's just not working. The happiest book you read this year. I have two. The first one is The Right Move by Liz Tomfordy. Yes, it had its moments that were sad and complex, but as a whole, the romance in that book, it was a happy book for me to read. And the other one is Summer Romance by Annabelle Monaghan. Probably Monaghan. Read. Monaghan. Literally what the title says, Summer Romance. Yes, again, it had its proper own complexities and sad moments that she was dealing with as a character, but the romance, the book itself, I consider to be a happy book. What was the saddest book you read this year? The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith. I talked about it earlier. Trigger warnings need to be looked at before you read this book. It was so sad. I cried with it. I got very angry with it at certain points. Not as in with the actual book, but what was happening in the book. I got so attached to Eden, our main character. It was a very, very sad book. And an honourable mention for a sad book I read is The Maze Runner by James Dashner, the first book. The ending, that's all I'm going to say on that. The most frustrating book you read this year, there's one I talked about earlier, which is Edge of Collapse, and so I'm not going to go into that entire explanation again, but on a similar wavelength, it was meant to be a thriller mystery type thing, is One of Us is Lying by Karen McManus. It took me so long to get into this book. Then when I was invested in the story, while the pacing was very, very slow, which already lowers the rating of this book down a very, 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 very big gap to what it could have been, is the pacing. But the ending of this book, was it technically classed as a plot twist? Okay, sure, maybe. But it just felt like I had this big anticipation for this ending of finding out what it is. And then it was just very, ugh. Like, that's the only way I can explain it. Like, I got to the end of the book and I was like, oh, just very, I'm trying to think of the word. What's the word? Anticlimactic. It was so anticlimactic of an ending, and it just frustrated me to my core. The best book adaptation of the year. Now, it wasn't released this year. However, I'm putting it as the best book adaptation of the year because I watched it this year, and I think that counts, which is Red, White, and Royal Blue. So true to what I read in the book. Every scene and character, everything was exactly how I had pictured it in my mind. The only thing that was different was the lake house. I pictured it as like a cabin-esque type thing. I don't know why, but it wasn't. It was very posh and big and grand. But it literally felt like I was reading the book again and picturing everything in my head, which is when you know something has been done correctly and perfectly. Favorite covers of the year. Favorite covers of the year was a very hard one for me to choose from. It was very, very difficult for me to choose favorite covers because there are so many covers that are so beautiful to look at. However, for me, I felt like I was stuck between The Way I Used to Be, because the cover of that book is so beautiful to look at, and the colors and the contrast and everything were perfect. And as a series of book covers, I put the Crown of Nyxia series by Carissa Broadbent, obviously. I think that each one of them has so many details in the covers that you look at them and you're like, oh my God, that's gorgeous. But then you look back at it after reading the book and you pick up on the little details that are in there. And it's just perfect. It's perfection. And I will continue to say that about the Crowns of Nyxia series because it's what it is to me personally. A book I haven't stopped thinking about. The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith, as I said earlier. Eden, the character, her story, everything has been in the back of my mind 24/7 since I've read that book. Not ashamed of that. And I think it's there also because it's the book I want to finish the duology of. Like, I want to read the second book of The Way I Am Now because I want to see where the rest of her story goes. And the other one is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I love this book. Another LGBT book, and it was everything. The writing, the story, the way it was split up into different parts based on each husband was very interesting to read. The other elements that were brought into it of the messages and the headlines and stuff like that being on the pages as it's actually like there and you're reading a newspaper was very interesting to read and a very cool visual element to have in a book that's not necessarily a picture. An unpopular book you loved. Now, I put The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Is it necessarily unpopular as a whole? No, because a lot of people have read it, and I think a lot of people have rated it pretty highly. However, it's not talked about enough, which is why I'm saying it's unpopular, because I think so many more people should read this book and talk about it continuously. So that is why it is an unpopular book that I loved. A book you thought you'd love but didn't. One of Us is Lying by Karen McManus. I thought I was going to love this book. I thought I was going to get so incredibly invested. I thought it's a mystery thriller. I'm going to love this. And it just did not hit for me. Book with the most unique concept you read this year. House of Salt and Sorrows by Aaron A. Craig. The reason I thought it was the most unique out of every single one I'd read, yes, there's other unique books I read this year, but what made this so much more unique was it felt very much like the 12 Dancing Princesses Barbie movie, and in a very twisted fantasy. Well, obviously Barbie isn't real, is it? But it's in a different way. But it's very similar to that movie in a very unique way. The whole concept of the book in itself, as well as the plot and the storylines and everything, was nothing like I'd read before, as well as nothing like I'd read the rest of the books that I read that year. Well, this year. A book you read this year that you would reread. I put 2 books. One is The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith, which I want to reread anyway because I want to annotate the book. I didn't annotate it the first time I read it, and I don't know why. And then one I put for just fun because it was so incredibly fun to read was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I would 100% reread this book. I'm not necessarily a big rereader. I like to just read the book, rate it, and then continue on. But I do want to reread because I also have this thought of, will it be a higher rating? Will it be lower? Will it be the rating I gave it when I first read it? No, I won't have the same sort of surprise as I did the first time around, but it would be fun to read because it's also a very fun and easy book to read. It's very enjoyable, entertaining, so it's one that I would definitely reread. Goodreads 2024 reading goal reflection and reading goal for 2025. So my reading goal for 2024 that I set halfway through this year was 50 books, because I had convinced myself that I was going to reach that because I was not going to fall into any type of reading slump. I wasn't going to have anything else going on in my life that would slow down this process of me reaching this goal. And like I said, I'm nearly at 30 books, which isn't bad. No, it's not great either. But when I say reading slump, I'm talking about an entire month of not reading a book. It was reading slumps to an extent of longevity. It wasn't a few days away from books. No. There was weeks, there was months. Big reading slumps, which I haven't had for a while now, and I'm very happy about that. I'm so happy I haven't had a reading slump for a very long time because I do want to read more books because I genuinely enjoy it. I really, really, really enjoy and love reading books. So 50 may have been a bit ambitious reflecting on the reading slumps and stuff I fell into, but I have to take into account all of the situations and the fact that I started midway through the year. However, my reading goal for 2025, I've estimated to be around 75 to 100 books, which I think is doable because now I've got an actual reading pace now. Before because I hadn't read for a long time, it was possibly more slow reading than I'd liked. But now that I'm a more fast-paced reader, I think I could get through more books. Also, there's lots of books that I want to read that are in series, so that already bumps it up to being more likely to be bigger books, because I read and started a few series this year, but most of the books I read that made up the reading goal bar thing on Goodreads were standalones. So I think it's almost easier to build that up when you have series that you're getting through, because it's 5 books that you want to get through instead of just one single standalone book. So I think 75 to 100 next year is definitely doable if I don't fall into very long book slumps. Book you wished you got to this year. I put the Chestnut Springs series by Elsie Silver. I saw this series everywhere. I know that loads of people love this series, and I just never got round to reading it, and it's on my list to read next year. It is one of the top book series, because it's not just a book, it's a book series that I want to read next year. It's definitely up there. And the last prompt, question thing for this reading wrap up is, what will you prioritize in your 2025 reading year? So as a whole, like, the main goal is to just enjoy reading. I love it. It's such a fun, great hobby to have. I'm so glad I got back into it. I'm so glad I decided to create this channel where I can upload this type of stuff and people enjoy it and you guys enjoy it. And I love that you guys get to see my genuine reactions and opinions on books, even if we agree and disagree. So as my main goal for next year is just to genuinely enjoy reading. I mean, I can't guarantee I'm going to love every single book I read, because it just doesn't happen. I mean, look at the reading wrap up I just did. It's not going to happen. I can't guarantee that I'm going to love a book. But if I love creating the content and the actual hobby, then I think even if I don't like a book, it's still worth reading. I don't know if that makes sense, but more like smaller goals for 2025 that I want to prioritize is I want to expand the genres I'm reading. Like, I want to get into dark romance. I want to read horror, maybe historical fiction. I definitely want to read more non-fiction books, because that's kind of where I started falling back in love with reading. Was I read a few non-fiction books, and then I went down the fiction route and I just stayed there and never really left. So I want to maybe read some memoirs, some autobiographies. I don't know if I'd read like a lot of poetry, because they're not necessarily books to rate, but psychology books, self-help books, stuff like that. I want to finish series, ones that I'm in the middle of, as well as ones that I end up starting later on in the year. And I want to expand out into some new authors, because I feel like I have go-to authors, and the reason they're go-to authors is because they're series I'm reading. And so I want to expand and give some new authors different, at least an opportunity to discover different authors and genres and stuff that I may enjoy. If I end up not enjoying them, it is what it is, and I'll just go back to the standard reading process I already have with the books that I know that I enjoy reading, as well as the authors. But yeah, that is my 2024 reading wrap up. I'm very excited to see where 2025 goes, and I will be delighted and more than happy for you to join along in the journey next year to see where the reading takes me. I want to try some new stuff out next year with videos of different challenges. I want to be a lot more consistent. So if I decide to do Vlogmas, I have learnt my lesson now to definitely film content before December actually starts. So like, if I'm reading vlogs and stuff in November, and start reading the Christmas books in November, because it just creates more content and it's less stressful. But yeah, that is it for the 2024 reading wrap up video, and I will hopefully see you in my next video tomorrow for the next Vlogmas episode. Bye.